This is the land. This is the cradle of mankind and the cradle of the future. A whole new territory for innovation, new promises and horizons. This is the land with many faces, many opinions, many views. All different, but gathered around this one cause, this one dream, this one mission. Empowering people through independent and reliable news. Sharing the Euronews team's 23 years of experience everywhere in Africa. This is the land where we want to defend our common belief and raise a Pan-African news perspective. This is the land where your voice will be heard. This is why today we are bringing Africa News, your voice.
Good afternoon and welcome to this very first episode of Africa News, The Debate, with me, Lauriane Vofokana. I am glad to be the moderator for today's discussion, which is centered around the effectiveness of youth-led activism in influencing government policies. Africa News, The Debate brings you a high-level panel to understand stakes behind the story occurring on the continent. This conversation takes place in this studio and at home, where you are, the audience, on our platforms. You can be joining us from YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook and sending us your questions. For almost 3 weeks now, Kenya has been shaken by protests. Young Kenyans have organized peaceful demonstrations meant to force authorities to drop a controversial finance bill meant to raise taxes and introduce fees on a range of daily items and services, such as internet data, to help us examine what is happening in Kenya now and see if youth-led activism is indeed effective in influencing government policies. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our panel. We'll be joined by Michael Oduor, a journalist from Africa News, who is Kenyan. Welcome, Michael. Joining us from Indonesia is Oliver Barker Vomawo, a prominent Ghanaian activist and a law and governance advisor. Welcome, sir. You have led protests against President Nana Akufo-Addo. Some members of our audience from the UK or Ghana might know you for that. You have been arrested. You are leader of the pressure group Fix the Country, which champions demonstrations in your country, Ghana, for youth to protest economic hardships, among other issues. Also joining us is Declan Galvin. You are the managing director of Gent Risk Advisory, a leading Nairobi-based strategic risk advisory firm. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
As I said in introduction, this debate is live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. If you follow us on our platforms, you can take part in this debate and send in your questions. Before we jump right into this, here's a news report on what happened yesterday in Nairobi during protests that occurred in the Kenyan capital. Take a look.
Anti-tax protesters clashed with the riot police in Nairobi on Tuesday, blocking roads and burning tires in response to unpopular tax legislation that had sparked deadly unrest earlier this week in Kenya. The finance legislation has faced intense opposition from the Kenyan public, particularly from the younger protesters struggling with rising living costs and unemployment. Last Tuesday, protesters stormed Parliament, prompting police to open fire in an incident that resulted in more than 39 deaths. Protesters expressed their distrust of President William Ruto's government despite his decision to send the finance bill back to Parliament with a promise to make budget cuts to offset the proposed new taxes and fees on various items and services, including egg import and banking services.
Don't move, eh? Michael, we saw that young Kenyans were out again in the streets yesterday to protest. In the report we just watched, there is a mention of a distrust of William Ruto's government to send the financial bill back to Parliament. If there is no trust, what will happen to the committee the president has promised would address the concerns of the youth who are dissatisfied with the state of the state's current affairs?
Well, thank you very much, Lorian, for the question. My name is Michael Oduor, as you've mentioned. So getting back to your question, we've been seeing a lot happening in Kenya, and what I can deduce from it is that so far President Ruto has said that the bill will be dropped, the entire amendment of the Finance Bill 2024 that will be dropped once the Parliament resume, because right now the Parliament is in recession for some few weeks, which I think they might resume in the next maybe 2 weeks or so. So given that, Kenyans are still showing displeasure. They seem like they don't trust what the president is saying, and there was some confusion within the law whereby it was stating that if the president doesn't assent to the law, to the new amendment, it means it will automatically become law in 14 days. But then the parliament itself is in recession, so Kenyans were kind of like seeing there was some mistrust between them and the government. Therefore, that's why you saw yesterday protests, and this was also culminated from the fact that the president had recently spoken to a few journalists, and what he said, it was I'm not sure that it was on Sunday, but sort of like people didn't trust what the president was telling them. Therefore, so far, I think that the bill itself is going to be revoked. It's in entirety, and the government itself, through President Ruto, has said that they're gonna be meeting with various stakeholders. Actually, they want over 100 stakeholders to meet, including youth representatives, who should come in to bring in new recommendation, what should be done in order for Kenya to know what to do next in terms of the next budget.
Oliver, from East Africa to West Africa, where you are now, where you're from, we have held a similar protest in your country, Ghana, and been a witness of the EndSARS protests in Nigeria. Just to give some context, the 2020 EndSARS protest saw thousands of young Nigerians protest police brutality and extrajudicial killings. Based on your experience, Oliver, can you draw parallels between what happened in Ghana last year and the years before in 2021, for example, and what is happening in Kenya now?
You know, I think that the biggest misconception that a lot of people are having and how we engage the debate is to assume that this is a conversation about a finance bill. It is not. It is a broader question about the gulf that exists between those who lead various African countries and young people's aspirations and desires for a different future. That is the conversation that is happening. And so it is not surprising then to me that we're saying, well, the president has said they're withdrawing the bill. Why are young people still on the street? Young people have lost faith and trust in terms of African leadership wholesale on the continent. There's a big generational divide between what our parents and forebears were willing to accept in terms of the quality and substandardness of governance and our aspirations and our dreams. The validity of those dreams and also our fear that our futures are being jeopardized by a political elite that have gotten away with so much and have done so little for us. This is the conversation that is broadly happening on the continent, and I think that what is happening in Kenya, it is not only the beginning, but also the culmination of an African spring that the world is not sufficiently paying attention to. There is going to be a changing of the guards on the continent, and that is going to be mainly driven by young people's activism, young people's desire for freedom, young people's desire for a different kind of politics. And I am very certain that there's going to be a contagious effect of what is happening in Kenya, in the same way that we saw happen in the West African sub-region, that these things are going to catch on because young Africans are demanding a different kind of politics. And the decrepit nature of our old politics is refusing to read the signs on the wall, I would say.
Thank you. Declan, just to bring you in, we've heard that the people want change, at least telling us, and what we can see on social media. Kenya is East Africa's economic powerhouse. You offer advisory services to leading private companies and multinational companies on strategic, geopolitical, trade, and security risks in markets across Africa. How are they reacting? Because change is no good news for them, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the context, and I would argue most importantly, the direction that Kenya is headed is sowing a tremendous amount of concern in the eyes of investors and companies that look to invest kind of within the region. Of course, as I'm sure you've reported, these protests are coming on the back of what was one of the most successful investment drives in Kenya's history, with President Ruto going to the United States, securing billions of dollars in investment. And, you know, just days after he comes back, we have significant unrest and civil disobedience across the country. And so it's leaving a lot of people scratching their heads saying, well, you know, do we need to kind of look at these ideas a little bit more in depth before we make larger financial commitments?
Indeed. I'll go to our audience now. You follow us on Facebook and YouTube. Please drop your comments in the comments section. Send us your questions so that we can send them again to our guests here, Declan Galvin and Oliver Barker Vomavo. Back to Vomawalter, sorry. Back to both of you. Indeed, President William Ruto was coming back from a trip to the US, where, as you said, Declan, there was good news, at least economically speaking. But the country was already in the dire situation, because we're talking about today's the recent demonstrations. But last year already, there were demonstrations led by the opposition coalition led by Raila Odinga, for example. We see them protest. We see them expecting change. We see the violence as well. We see the destruction and the bad impact on the economy. How can activism, this one is for you, Oliver, bring about the change that we're waiting for? And as you said, that the forefathers promised, or at least tried to pave the way to see come to light.
I think one thing is important. We need to have a long-term view of the changes that societies ought to go through in order to ensure social justice and equity across board. One of the things that is, you know, loud and clear from the conversation and what, you know, young Kenyans are participating in, it's I would say a denunciation of the neoliberal politics of indebting African countries, of creating debt, and also, you know, using finance and taxes as a way in which to alleviate that debt from all kinds of bonds, whether it's the Euro bonds or kind of multilateral or sovereign debt in general. And it's interesting to me that when we're talking about, you know, the rebounds of the Kenyan economy, or we're talking about investment, we're also thinking about the same way of approach. You know, an African leader goes to Washington and, you know, goes and begs for some things and then comes back again, and then we're supposed to shout hooray. No, I think that's the fundamental structure of our economies that need to change in order to be able to meet the aspirations of young Kenyans and young Africans across board. But this is one of the most important things that we are missing, even in terms of the conversation. When you look at the category of people who are on the street, we are talking about the Gen Zers. In most countries across board, we are trying and struggling as to the way in which we can get young people politically interested, to be able to get them participating in the general and big issue conversations that are happening in the country. Kenya is showing the example of how young people are not only confined to the TikToks and using them for destructive activities or mindless dancing here and there, but for political mobilizing, for being engaged and being sufficiently caring about the politics of their countries in order to drive substantive conversation about how do we change and progress going forward. That is the marker and the defining thing that we are seeing here in Kenya. It is an example that young people across board need to be able to learn wherever they are. We've seen that kind of mobilization in the past, which has stayed mainly virtual in some regards in certain Western countries. But this is, in fact, boots on the ground, and that's commendable in many ways. This is what you want to be able to see to have a democratic conversation. Now, this has happened now. The question about, you know, how do you move and change policies, how do you be able to engage in a constructive framework, is not only the responsibility of young Kenyans who are mobilizing, but it's also a responsibility of the politics. And this is where change happens very slowly, because you know, old elites and the structure system politicians have a certain disposition towards receiving new ideas, being engaged by different audiences, that they are slow to be able to know how to respond. We saw this happening in Ruto's case, for instance, where he came out and essentially calling protesters criminals. They're using the same old register, the same language to be able to engage a new audience that is demanding a different kind of politics. For us to be able to successfully engage young Africans, we need to be able to change the mindset and the register with which we have done politics in the past. We have to be able to meet in a framework that is consensual, that is also concedes that a lot of mistakes have been done in the past, that young Africans or young people have felt the opportunities of the future shrivel. We have to be able to be apologetic for the precarity in which we have placed their situation in order for us to have an honest and open framework towards a productive and reformist political conversation. This is what is slowly mass install itself in Kenya and mass install itself in various African countries across the globe. And I trust you, young Africans are going to demand this, and they're going to demand the changes that the continent needs forcefully, and they're not going to resile in that obligation, I think.
Declan, on this as well, based on your experience as someone who gives advice to investors and different groups who contact you, what would you say? Would you say that they have a preferred strategy or a tactic from those partaking into protest that they see as less frightening than others? Is there a way in the middle for them? Because people want change, so they will go out to protest. But is there a preferred way these investors, those you counsel, actually prefer to see?
Fundamentally, what the problem is, fundamentally what the problem is, whether it's in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, is there's a lack of inclusivity with regard to policymaking, with regard to writing laws, the types of public participation that occur on kind of really key directions that a country is going. That participation is flawed or inadequate, and so ultimately, what is needed is more inclusivity. Greater participation and mobilization of youth, and just more effort on behalf of the political class around national dialogue and conversation. And if that were to happen, then we wouldn't have the degree of alienation that segments of society feel, and there wouldn't be these kinds of crises that do appear to be increasing in number across the continent. Very much what Oliver mentioned. The protests that we're seeing, it's not about the finance bill. It is the finance bill is the manifestation of a whole range of social and economic grievances that have been neglected in Kenya for decades, and it's really just kind of come to a head at this moment. So if we have greater inclusivity, we'll have stronger societies and more consensus on the direction that countries should go.
Well, the two of you give an example, cite an example, a country. Maybe we're focusing on Africa, but we can broaden our perspective. Is there a country out there where you would say an alternative, an efficient alternative has been found to include, as you say, the public, those who are voting, the power to the people, as we say, those the people, their representative, and then in the decision making, how the country goes, how it is directed?
Well, I'll go first. You know what? I mean, I think that one of the things that I've always found very fascinating, in terms of when the African story is told and in terms of the African demands are made, it is that it is actually very human, the demands that are being made. There's nothing unique about it. And you talk about country, I look, for example, at the Finland example, and I wonder to myself, you have a country which is essentially run by young people. You have the cabinet, the prime minister, a lot of it, but the vast majority of people who are under 40 years old. This is a country that has sufficiently integrated young people into the voice and decision-making of their countries. And I believe that my most energetic years are when I'm in my my 30s or my early 40s. I do hope that when I'm hitting my 50s, that I'm are more resigned to catering for children and also retiring. But that's the opposite is the case. We have a president who's octogenarian. We have many members of cabinet in Ghana, for instance, where if you combine 10 people's ages, it's over 800 years. That is frightening. That is not the people to commit the future of a country to. So our question is simple. When you're seeing more and more countries, in the global north, even, for example, whether it's a prime minister level, where there's a critical post where it's younger people who are taking the front and leadership. Younger people who are able to speak the language of change, the language of the aspirations of this century, rather than what we are seeing more and more happening on the continent. Then you have a problem. And I think both Declan and I agreed that there's a deep sense of alienation that young people on the continent do feel about the future of the continent. And I suppose this would be fine if we were economically kosher, right? I feel like if the levels of happiness, of social and economic emancipation were fine, many people would consider themselves or maybe devote themselves to the arts or any other thing that gets the attention. But that's not the case here. Those who have been in charge of these countries have run them to the ground. That corruption is high, that you have persons who have made their lives on the public purse, who have built generational wealth on the public purse. And the other side of the coin, on the weighted side of the coin, you're seeing poverty abound. You're seeing so many people being pushed into the abyss of poverty without any way out of that. We are seeing medical tourism of the elite. We are seeing all kinds of vices that continue to hurt our aspirations for an egalitarian society, or at least a society that meets the needs and the basic necessities of everyday people. That is what I want to see. And I see an example in Finland, for instance, and that's, for me, it's instructive that young Africans would aspire for some of the blessings of liberty that are happening in a Scandinavian country.
You all who follow us on our socials, you can comment and give us your thoughts as well. Oliver Barker-Vomawo talked about age. Ruto was elected on the basis that he was younger than his predecessor and that he presented himself as a hustler. Tell us what you think about it. Share with us the questions you want us to share and pass on to our guest. Declan, would you have an example you would like to share with us of an efficient share of power between the government and the people that is supposed to govern?
So I guess I'll kind of just answer the question by making a point. Contentious politics is healthy, right? So a society or a country which does not have protests or freedom of public assembly and that kind of tension around political, social, and economic issues. A country that doesn't have that, I think, is a major red flag, and it starts making me think that there's much more deeper and sinister issues kind of going on within that society. And so I think any society that is allowing those kinds of freedom assemblies is functioning, somewhere within its kind of optimal within its optimal level. The problem sets that we're having, particularly in Kenya and Nigeria, is when you have unarmed, particularly youth protesters who are deeply frustrated with the conditions of a country. You have security service excesses, you have extrajudicial violence, you have unarmed protesters being gunned down. This is the indicator and the hallmark of a country and a society which is just not working. And so it needs a much deeper rethink. And there needs to be, again, to go back to this point, deeper and more robust inclusivity around decision-making, so that it doesn't come to the point where you could take your life into your hands by going and protesting against a government.
Thank you. One question for Oliver Barker from our audience. What do you predict will be the future of youth-led activism in Africa? Are there emerging trends that we should be aware of?
One of the things that we've banged upon in terms of Africa's democratization process is that the growth of civil society organizations would lead the frontier, will be at the frontier of advancing and liberalizing the political space. Unfortunately, a lot of them have become, whether they become captured, many civil society actors have now become auditioning grounds for politics and to catch the eye of politicians, and for which reason you're seeing a growth of what we are calling social movements. And I think that the nature of social movements that depend less on maybe donor funding, that are less beholden to the politics of the day, are not civil, in fact, with the system, and are not very keen on maintaining the status quo, become true vehicles of reform that I think that the potential of which we are under harnessed, that young people are able to mobilize themselves in the ways in which would push the conversations in many ways. Now, protest is not the only way in which social movements have operated. In fact, in Ghana, for instance, in terms of the things we've done, even though we've brought over 100,000 young Ghanaians onto the streets over different protests, we also do a lot of petitions. We are in court constantly. We do civic initiatives. All these things that bring attention to social problems become an offshoot of a broader mobilization. And I think the problem with many African countries,
have these petitions been successful?
And that's a very critical point. And this is what shows the frustration of a system that is built on exclusion and refusal to listen. We have done so many petitions, done police complaints. A lot of the times, the police complaints, even against senior officials, the police will come back and tell you that we've lost it. We are afraid, we are unable to move on them. Those petitions and court actions are either slowed down deliberately, thrown out, or even not heard of. All ways in which the administrative setup have been instrumentalized to shut people out. That is the way in which they have been trained to function. But it's by constantly knocking on the door, is refusing to give up, is bringing an avalanche of these initiatives that would make them buckle down under the pressure and teach them the new reality of forceful democratic participation that the young people are demanding. But I do think that if countries wanted to be more responsive to how young people communicate and how young people express themselves politically and democratically, we have to be able to increase the democratic pathways for participation. Declan gives an example, which I agree with, is the question that we have been tormented about around police violence and police brutality and extrajudicial killings around protests when young people gather, and the ways in which their voices are immediately militarized as a way to justify the use of force against them. I am currently facing treason charges, the ridiculousness of treason charges that by some absurd notion, our activism, democratic however it may be, is in an attempt to overthrow the government or the regime in place. Those absurdities are not only laughable, but they betray the lack of commitment to true democratic ideals. That is what the danger is for me in terms of how we go forward. But mobilizing young people will and continue to do, and we better make space for that, I think.
Thank you. One question from our audience to Declan Galvin. Even when policy changes are achieved, what challenges do youth movement face in ensuring these policies are effectively implemented?
So I think we need to recognize globally, but certainly in a geographic split space like Africa, where the majority of the world's young people live, that there's always going to be a tense relationship between generation and state power, and that this is something that's going to be that's going to persist, in perpetuity, again, until we have more political and social inclusion. So the problem set that audience member is asking and referring to, that's going to happen in perpetuity until we start having more inclusion. And again, we're talking about youth, but that's just one element of society. It's also about gender. It's about ethnic minorities. It's about people with different orientation. It's about people with different political attitudes. And until state power is confident enough and mature enough to allow more people to meaningfully contribute, the problem sets that was described in the question are going to continue.
So as you said, ethnicity, gender, political orientations, those are some of the risks you present your clients with when they want to invest in Africa, when you present them the
Certainly.
markets.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the problems particularly when we start talking about lending and the indebtedness that African nations are accumulating, is that there's such a narrow field in which decisions are made in terms of how much to lend to certain countries, what the conditions are, and what those interest rates are. And there needs to be a broader rethink and a broader conversation on other kinds of indicators that need to be used to assess kind of the kind of credit worthiness of these countries. And I think political and social risk indicators must be part of that conversation. And right now, if you look at how decisions get made, they're not as significant as what I would say are more superficial macroeconomic indicators. And so the entire approach to these problem sets are based off of antiquated frameworks and kind of limited thinking. And that's certainly not the way decisions need to be made in the future. Africa is the most dynamic, diverse, compelling continent, I think, in the world. And we're still treating it with frameworks from the 1980s and policies from the 1990s. And it just really needs to stop.
Oliver, as Declan just said, Africa is a vibrant continent and the capabilities are vast. What is the way forward, would you say, for?
I think that the way forward, not only in terms of the what, but also the how, is going to be a very painful process. I mean, as any society that's going through change, must anticipate that it's not going to be an easy one. What gives me hope in this process is that I think that young Africans are understanding what it takes. Sure, there's a significant number of people that believe that the way forward is to, as Nigerians say, japa, meaning that to leave the countries, which is a resignation in itself. But there's so many people that are still left behind that have the hope that they can engage their countries in a necessary process of reform and dialogue. And so reform and dialogue is the way and way forward. That we have to understand that on top of the embedded problems of economic and social economic exclusion is also political exclusion. There have to be strong governance reforms. There have to be reset up of the institutions of governance in a way in which we deliver on everyday governmental promises that have to change. It is not a new concept. It is not something being reimagined. Every society ought to change. But what I am most concerned about is the increase in gulf that exists between those who lead us and those who young people are. That wide gap, or that gap is wider in Africa than everywhere else. If you take Ghana, for instance, you have a president who is almost 80 years old. We have the vast majority, the median age of the country be around 16 and 17. That is significant. That is more than 3 lifetimes of those young people. So I think that it is important that the process, when we are thinking about the process of reform, that we are not only committed to it in rhetoric, but that we are putting in place a real program of social reconciliation and dialogue that allows us to be able to democratize the economic, the social, and political space to bring young people into the process. But as we are bringing young people into the process as well, we have to understand the problem is not only domestic, but it's also a global problem. There are global problems around, lending and financing of African states. There are problems around trade. There are problems around dumping and treating Africa as a market rather than as a potential for its people to be able to grow and lift themselves out by their own bootstraps. We have to be able to differently conceptualize even how the global audiences interact with Africa as a continent, but also different African societies in that process. So I don't see the urgency when it comes to the top-down approach, but at least from the bottom up, from what young people are demanding, I can see great enthusiasm and a desire for change that we can take forward.
I'll go back to Michael Oduor, African news journalist from Kenya. Michael, all roads entering and exiting the State House in Nairobi were closed yesterday. The country's main opposition coalition today, the Orange Democratic Movement of Raila Odinga, has recalled MPs who voted in favor of the finance bill. What do you think is likely to happen in the next few days on the political scene, arena, and in the streets?
Well, thank you, Lorian. Quite a lot still happening in Kenya, and as you can see yesterday, you saw quite a number of youths who showed up to protest in various many towns and cities like Mombasa, Nakuru, Nairobi, and other small towns. And this is just a culmination, like our guest had said, it's not just the tax issue or the tax increase that the regime of President Ruto is trying to push through. It's about also other issues and fundamental issues that now are making the youth to come out, like corruption, nepotism, and
respect, not just respect, but the government not heeding to court orders or not respecting the court orders, and many other things like the government overspending more than it should use. And these are some of the things that are making use to be up there in the street. So when you saw yesterday, again, the opposition leader saying they'll recall the MPs who voted yes for this finance bill. And yes, this is some of the after effects now that you'll have to see, because apparently some of the MPs who voted yes, especially from the Ruto's side, have had to face the wrath of the public. Some of their businesses were burnt down, were looted. Some of them who had businesses like supermarkets were looted. Some of their homes and offices were even razed down by angry public who are their constituents. And therefore, you see a lot of tension still there, especially among the youths. And this is just as a result of many other issues that I just mentioned. And therefore, we expect in the next few days, because the government is still watching the situation as it unfolds. They're trying to see, and because we also have some people who've been arrested, a few protesters who've been brought forward to the court. And some of them have been released, some of them are still in custody, some have different issues that are really affecting them. Like, for instance, the government has said that we have now goons who have penetrated some of these protests. And they took this opportunity to loot some of the businesses. And therefore, these are some of few individuals. Even like today in the morning, we had the director of criminal investigation who published photos of some of these people who broke into various business premises. Therefore, the government is still watching as it unfolds, and of course, opposition too are a bit keen on what next they can do, apart from recalling some of their members. And if you look at now the public themselves, the youth themselves, they call themselves the Generation Z. What they are calling for is very simple to the government, despite the government calling them to speak to them. What they're telling the government is that please stop corruption, stop the ethnic appointments in governments, respect court orders, and furthermore create jobs. And on top of this, reduce your taxes. And these are some of the things that we are still yet to see if the government will try to address. And yes, of course, lastly, to add this, there were some quotas. Some of the youths were calling for president to even resign over this. Well, this is a long call, and the president himself, when he spoke last week, he said there are procedures for him to be recalled or for him to quit the seat.
Declan, my last question to you. Michael Oduor said it, that there are calls now for the president, William Ruto, to resign. And the government, they insist that they now need to borrow money. It is the only way for them to plug the deficit. What should we expect now? How can they resolve this crisis? Or how can they reassure some of the people you counsel?
Thanks for the question. So there are some key things that the president really needs to do in more or less this week, right? And they're overdue. So the first is he needs to provide reassurance to the public that he's genuinely listening and that he's genuinely taking their concerns, which are clearly articulated under strong consideration for action, on action and changes in policy. One of the things he very likely needs to do is to reshuffle his cabinet and bring in people who are going to work for his agenda and who are going to be inclusive leaders for Kenya. Another thing he needs to do is he needs to more succinctly articulate the kinds of changes that he intends to make in the finance bill and connect those changes to the grievances and frustrations that protesters have. And the third thing that he needs to do is kind of what we say in Kenya. He needs to humble himself. The speeches that he's made have either done the bare minimum, according to the public, or actually rekindled their frustration to a much stronger degree. So his first speech that he made last week on Tuesday where he called demonstrators treasonous. He called people criminals. That kind of language was really rekindled the anger in the country. And so what needs to happen is he kind of needs to begin to approach the public hat in hand, take responsibility for the failings of his government, and then provide the assurances in line with their expectations on how things will change moving forward.
Thank you, Declan. A new audience, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, what do you think are 3 priorities the president needs to address to pave a way out of this crisis Kenya is grappling with? Thank you, Oliver Barker Vomawa. Thank you, Declan Galvin, for your time, for your insight.
Thank you.
That wraps this. Thank you, Michael, of course, for your insight as well.
Thank you.
That wraps this inaugural episode of Africa News, the debate with me, Lauriane Vofokana. But the discussion continues on all our platforms and on africanews.com. Bye for now.
A whole new territory for innovation, new promises and horizons. This is the land with many faces, many opinions, many views. All different, but gathered around this one cause, this one dream, this one mission, empowering people through independent and reliable news. Sharing the Euronews team's 23 years of experience everywhere in Africa. This is the land where we want to defend our common belief and raise a pan-African news perspective. This is the land where your voice will be heard. This is why today we are bringing Africa News, your voice.